Good afternoon, y'all. Thanks so much for being here. This is the ADI Books Deeper Dive, and we're on fifth grade right now. And I am your moderator. I'm Krista Sampson, and I am here with Victor Sampson, who will be presenting today. And so I will hand it over to Vic.
So in this one, we wanted to talk a little bit about the fifth grade books. So do a deeper dive into those. We have two versions of our fifth grade book. One's written for Texas, that's aligned with the Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills for fifth grade. That includes physical science, earth space science, and life science investigations. There's 8 of them in there. Each one of those are focusing on a specific TEKS. Then we also have an NGSS version for fifth grade as well. This one also has investigations for physical science, life science, and earth space science. And there you'll notice these are different investigations because there are different standards that are used in the NGSS and in Texas for fifth grade. So you kind of got to decide which book is best for your context. Today, I thought we could talk over a life science investigation, the Chihuahuan Desert ecosystem. So we're going to do that today. So I'm going to kind of walk you through how this one looks, how it flows, what the handouts look like, and the features that you can use when teaching this investigation. So what we always start off with here is a handout for the task stage. And what we want to start with is always introducing a phenomenon. And a phenomenon is just kind of some event that happens in the world that kids can see, but not yet quite explain. So in this case, we introduce this desert, talk a little bit about where it is, and then we show them a video about some of the snakes that can be found in that area. And then we ask them to write down some things that they notice as they're watching that video. From there, we'll move, have kids share out their ideas or things they noticed from the video, and then we move into the task. In this case of this investigation, we're going to talk a little bit about what happens if you remove some of these organisms from the food web, like the snakes or something else, or a food source for the snakes. What does that happen to the flow of matter that's in that ecosystem? So when from that task, when they are given that question that they're going to answer, then they go and kind of talk about their initial ideas of like what might happen when something might die or something might become more common or nothing might happen at all. We ask them to draw out a model to kind of explain what they're thinking and then share that with their team. Once they start sharing that ideas with their team, they're going to have a bunch of other questions because they're not going to be sure about stuff. We ask them then to come up with a few question that would help them make sense of the bigger question of the investigation. So let me show you the video of how that ends up working. What we try to do to make this as easy as possible for you is each of the books comes with a book code to our Learning Hub. And our Learning Hub, you can create a free teacher account. And basically, that's just your name and your email. And then once you have that account, you enter your book code, and then that populates the entire your account with the investigations that are in your library. So once you have those, then you can click on any investigations, for example, on the desert ecosystem. And then there's a button in there that you can download all the handouts so you can print them off and then give them to students. But more importantly, you have a presentation mode. So this is a screenshot of what the presentation mode looks like. And you can project this on a screen, and it allows you to be able to show this and have students follow along as you're going through. So you don't have to make slide decks to kind of guide students through these. What's also nice about them is they include all the videos and the images. So let me show you the video that that you need to show for this investigation.
The Chihuahuan Desert is great snake territory, full of blacktails, diamondbacks, and Mojave rattlers.
Well, the only place we're going to find blacktails is up there. Rocks, yucca plants, cactus, heat. And that's a bit of a hike. Always watch where you put in your hand. Check this out. This is a mortal rattlesnake. They live all over the place here, but look how camouflaged they are. Same color rock, little shadows. He's quite an old one. This is a full-grown specimen. Just lift your pen. I'm not going to bother you, buddy. There we are. Rule number 1, always use your stick. Look at that. And pink belly. What a pretty snake, man. That's my first one.
The mottled rock rattler is synonymous with these treacherous outcrops. Only 2 feet in length when fully grown, its grayish-pink scales blend seamlessly into the cliffs and boulders it calls home. There are more surprises to come.
So this is about a 3-minute video that gives them a really good idea of what this desert looks like, much more than they can ever get from a static picture. And then you can flip through to the next slide and say, okay, some of the things they notice, and they're going to come up with tons and tons of things and get really excited. That's when you introduce the task and focusing on all the different kinds of living things that are in the desert, and what happens if some of those were to disappear. From there, that moves us into the idea stage. So they're going to have all of these questions about what's going on. So we can start introducing pieces of the puzzle. So what we do here in this case, we'll introduce the idea of ecosystems. Like, what do we mean by that? What are the different roles that living things play in an ecosystem, like being a producer or a consumer, or a decomposer? What I usually do is I'll read these aloud to students, and kind of when there's something interesting or important, or I think important, I'll stop and say, hey, that might be a good idea, or maybe put a star next to that. Then have the students at the end discuss what's going on in there and write down some ideas that they think would be really useful for them answering the question of what would happen if you remove some of the organisms from the ecosystem in this desert. A second idea that we introduce is then actually talking about the flow of matter a little bit. So we talk about how food chains and food webs show up, and how food moves as matter and gives mass to different living things. Once again, they can pick out some ideas that they think would be really helpful. And then we also talk about this idea of healthy and unhealthy ecosystems. So like, what happens when an ecosystem is disturbed and it's no longer able to function as it normally can. So it gives them a way to kind of talk about what might, if the ecosystem could stay healthy or not when these organisms are removed. One of the other things that we do in the Learning Hub, there is all of this text as well that also includes all of these images that are on their handouts, but they're in color, that allows you to click on them and you can blow them up so they can see them nice and clear up on the screen. It makes it really easy for kids to for you to kind of point out things as you're moving through these ideas that you're introducing to students. The other thing after that is then you can then introduce them to, or ask them to start planning and carrying out their investigation. What you want to always do with that is provide the materials that they're going to be using during their investigation, so they get an idea of what that looks like. In this investigation, they're going to be actually given cards of different types of living things that are in that ecosystem. And I'll talk a little bit about what their source of matter of energy, and other information about them. And then they can use those cards during their investigation to try to figure out what would happen if one of those was to be removed or to die out. What would happen to the other organisms in the ecosystem? So in this case, what we then have them do is, after you introduce those cards, they can go ahead and plan on investigation. We provide graphic organizers to support them for doing that. In this case, it's relatively easy. They're basically, what's the question you're trying to answer, what observations or measurements you're going to need, and then how you're going to analyze those observations or measurements that you collect. What they'll do in this investigation is they'll actually use these cards to create a food web. So what they can do is then organize these cards based on who eats what, and then they can draw arrows between them on a whiteboard or other pieces of paper to show how the flow of matter moves through the ecosystem there. As they're working, then they can collect data, so they can draw maybe for perhaps a initial food web that shows how the matter moves with all the organisms there, and then they can remove single organisms one at a time, and then see what impact that has on the other organisms of the in the ecosystem. Once they're done with that, they can write down any observations or measurements, maybe how many other things die or how many things are not affected. And then from there, they can then make sense of their data, and they can create a model to kind of show what would happen depending on what type of organism, either like a producer or consumer, is removed, or one specific type of producer or consumer. So they can kind of make that as a model to show what ends up happening. After they're done making sense of their the data they collected, they will have an answer to the guiding question. So what we want each group then to do is to share what they figured out in the form of an argument. And we have them do these on these whiteboards, and we ask them to include 4 things. What's the question you're trying to answer? What's your answer to that question, which is your claim, your evidence in support of your claim, and then a justification of your evidence that talks about why that's important. In the case of this investigation, their evidence is probably picture different models of food webs with some organisms missing. So they need to be able to justify why using food webs in the first place. So they'd be talking about the flow of matter and their feeding relationships and in ecosystems. What's really cool about this part is kids are then finally connecting all of those ideas that we introduced them to what they're seeing to explain something different. Once every group's got their argument, they share those out, they give each other feedback, and then they can return back to their original groups and modify and make their argument better. And then we include a handout here that allows them to write down some notes that they can keep track of things so they can make those improvements. If kids are struggling with the making those arguments, we also include some extra supports in Learning Hub. So this is an image of a slide that you can show in the presentation mode that gives a little bit more information for students about what to include in their arguments. That's often helpful when kids get stuck. Once all the kids have finalized their argument and have a good answer to that, what you want to do then is discuss 2 things as a whole class. One, the core ideas that they were using, not the answer to the guiding question, but the core ideas. In this case, they're talking about ecosystems and tracking matter, the flow of matter within an ecosystem, which is basically a food web. So you're asking them to make sure they understand those ideas. And then you also want to talk about how they engage in the practices. So let me show you how this works real quick. So in Learning Hub, we include these discussion prompts for both the ideas and the practices. So in this case, we have this one. So it's an example of a food web. It's the same one they saw in the ideas phase. But then we ask them to, okay, just seeing this image, how could you explain what's happening in this? Why is it set up this way? Talk this over. And you can have kids talk in their small groups about how they would explain it, and then they can share out, and then you can correct any misconceptions that they might have. Then after you're happy with if they're understanding the content really well, then you can move on to the practices discussion. And that basically is to get them to reflect on what they did about designing and carrying out investigations and engaging in the other practices of science. So to do that, we include these 3 discussion prompts. The first one is, what things did you do during the investigation that made it scientific? So they're kind of thinking about what went well during their investigation. Then you ask them about things that they may have done differently to make it more scientific. So kind of identify the weaknesses in what they did. And then from there, ask to come up with class rules that we can all keep in mind the next time we follow an investigation and or design and carry out an investigation. The reason we do this is we want students to learn from their mistakes. They're children. They're not going to do perfect investigations or engage in the practices perfectly because they're complex and they're new to them. But we want to give them an opportunity to learn from those mistakes. So the best way to do that is to identify things that didn't go so well and make a plan for the future to do better. We also include a handout, a place for them to keep track of any important ideas. So for example, if you're after discussing the core ideas of the investigation, if you want them to take any kind of notes, they can add that here. This is also a great place where they can add kind of their rules for their next investigation or things that they have to keep in mind. So you can go back and have them refer to that later on. The last thing we ask students to do is then on their own, write a report to share what they learned. And this is really to help them build their literacy skills in the context of science. So for the report, fairly simple. It has 3 sections. One is the introduction. That's just what they were trying to figure out. Then there's the method section. What did they do to answer that question that they were trying to answer? And then there's the argument is what they learned, right? So, and that comes basically from their group argument that was on the whiteboard that they refined. Now they're just putting into paragraph form, so it all flows through their individual writing. Once each student has written one of those, we enter what we call a peer review. And for the younger kids, we recommend either like groups of 2 or 3. Usually around 5th grade, I find groups of 2 work really well. So say you have a group, a class of 24 students, you can group those students into 12 pairs, have them sit in different parts of the room. You've got a report written by each individual student. So you give each pair a report written by somebody outside the pair and this peer review guide. And then you give them 15 minutes to read over the report and then fill out the peer review guide. And the peer review guide is designed to ask them questions to encourage them to think about what would be good feedback. So asking things like, is there a good overview of the phenomenon, or does the claim fit with evidence? So if they think yes, they mark off yes, and there's no changes needed. If they say somewhat or no, then they need to explain how to make the report better. And there's a little spot where it says reviewers there where they can write down their feedback from that. It takes about 15 minutes to review a report and give feedback. So you collect all of the ones that have been peer reviewed and their peer review guide, then give each pair another report and another peer review guide. Give them another 15 minutes to fill that out. At the end of the process, each pair is reviewed 2 reports, and everybody that wrote a report has been reviewed by a pair. So everybody gets feedback, plus has a chance to talk about other people's work so they can kind of develop these rules or norms for what counts as good writing. Then from there, you can hand back everyone's draft in their peer review guide and ask them to make a final draft. You can once again give them sentence starters, or you can have them do it on a blank piece of paper or type it, however you want to do it. But then they write their final report, and then they can turn back the final report, the rough draft, and the peer review guide into you. You can then use the peer review guide as your rubric for grading. You can go through and give each section a score, and then you can add that to their grade book. The nice thing about this is they look really good by this point, and everybody gets a good grade at the end of this, and they learned a ton, and you've got a nice authentic assessment of what kids learned during this process. Okay, so that was a deep dive into one of these investigations. If you feel like that's a lot to remember, no worries. We've got detailed lesson plans for you in each of these books. So this is a lesson plan that goes with this investigation, and they all follow the same basic format. You're going to start with some overview that gives you a description of the investigation, what's the question, and what kids figure out. Then we include a graphic that shows you how you can break this investigation over multiple days into 25 minutes chunks. Most of the time that works out to be a stage. Sometimes it's activities within a stage. It also tells you your standards. It reminds you that you have access to the Learning Hub, so you can get to that presentation mode. We also include information about things to know. So when you're doing that reflective discussion, it talks about the core ideas and the cross-cutting concepts and the practices, right? So you can kind of share these ideas with students and help them develop more nuanced ideas about all of these. We also include a section that has all the materials, right? So all the cards, how to prep them, how to set it up. You can either source these things yourself, or we have kits that are available in our store that you can get that has enough materials for each class. Makes it super easy to do that. And then finally, we have the actual lesson plans, and what we did is divided them by activities within stage. So for example, each stage has multiple activities. So the task stage has 3 activities associated. These are the first 2, activity A and activity B. You can see activity A is where you're introduced to the phenomenon. It tells you about how much time you're going to need, how to group the students, what to do, what to give out, what to show on the screen, as well as teaching tips and some things to keep in mind of attending to equity in your classroom. So you can see that for each of those, it makes a nice, easy way to do a quick read through for what you're trying to get done with that day. So it's not overwhelming. Also important to remember, this doesn't mean you have to follow these exactly. This is basically written how we would do it if we were to go into the classroom for the first time or take over your classroom for the first time and guest teach. But you don't have to follow these, make modification that best fits your context. But it gives you a good idea of how to get started. So with that, if there's any questions, we'll take those now. We got about a little under 10 minutes left on our webinar. If you have a question, you can add it to the Q&A section. You can just click on the raise your hand button and we can call on you. And when we do, you can unmute so we can hear you.
Okay, one question from Marcia. What supports are included to help my multilingual learners?
Awesome. So in those lesson plans, what we have done is those sections that are labeled attending to equity all have ideas about what you can do in terms of preferential seating, giving students opportunities to interact with others, all little pieces of advice. Then on top of that, each of the stages, we've tried to build in ways to make it possible for someone to learn a new language as easily as possible while they're learning the content. So we add graphic organizers, we encourage multiple modalities of communicating ideas. We have all of those pieces kind of added in there, and those are all tied in together. So it really, what we're really proud of is this creates a really language-rich learning environment where kids have an opportunities to read, write, speak, and listen in a new language so they can quickly start picking it up. So it works pretty well that way.
Excellent. That's it for questions. So I will let you continue on.
Awesome. So this wraps up our third through 5 deep dives. The next one we're going to be moving into is middle school. So tomorrow, the 16th, from 4:30 to 5, we're going to be looking at life science, and then 5 to 5:30, we'll be doing physical science. So hopefully you can join us. We'll continue a little bit more middle school the following week on that. So hope you can join us for those.
All right. Thanks so much, all. Have a good night.